folks. Welcome to episode 9 of the show. I'm Doc Norton. You may have noticed that the title of the show has changed. From now on, we're just going to call it Refactorings. I am making a bit of a move away from some of the brands around clean code and craftsmanship. I don't feel aligned with some of the leadership in those movements. And ultimately, it wasn't about the brands for me. It was about writing good code and doing our jobs well. And I think we can continue doing that, and I think refactoring is a part of that, and that's really what this series is anyway. So without much more explanation, refactorings with Doc Norton. All right, so the big move we're going to make this episode is we want to move build classes into our class containers and class container construct because it makes more sense that it's actually there. As we start to look at build classes, all it's doing is interrogating class containers anyway. But in order to do that, we've got to move some other stuff around because build classes depends on parse from source. Parse from source depends on stream source. And it depends on our actual parser. So we're going to have to move a few things around to actually free up parse from source so that it can move, which will then begin the process of moving build classes. All right, we're moving stuff out of JavaClassBuilder into other classes where it probably fits better. What I want to start with in this episode is I want to move parse from source into class containers. And I can't do that right away because stream source is a private inner class for JavaClassBuilder. And our parser is a field on JavaClassBuilder. And our parse from source relies on both of these. So we're just going to do some quick adjustments here. We're going to make the parser be a parameter, and then we're going to change stream source to an external class. All right, so we're going to go ahead and change the signature. We will add the abstract parser as our parameter. Let's call it parser. And default value will be this.parser. So what's going to get passed in is the field from JavaClassBuilder. And then let's change the internal reference to this.parser to just parser, which is the parameter we passed in. And now we're good. All right, now with that done, we can go ahead and promote stream source to its own class. All right, now parse from source will move nice and clean over into class containers. All right, so let's head back to JavaClassBuilder. And we still can't move build classes because it actually relies on get jar file entries. We could inline this and then move it over, but I think we're going to want it extracted anyway. So let's go ahead and move that. When we move it, it's going to pass in a JavaClassBuilder as a parameter. It's just part of the way that the IDE does this. So we'll go ahead and remove the JavaClassBuilder as a parameter since it's not necessary and keep this nice and clean. Okay, so we're almost ready to move build classes over into our class containers, but we actually want to move the parser up a level. So the parser needs to be a parameter to build classes. So I'm going to do a little bit of a trick here. What I'm going to actually do is force the creation of a build classes that has the parser as a parameter. So I'm going to basically create a pass through from our original call to this new call. All right, so that set us up pretty nicely. We can actually go ahead and move build classes into class containers at this point. And then we can remove the extra parameter that we don't need. And we can confirm that everything actually is still running. Right now, we're almost ready to move build over into class containers as well. But we're going to go ahead and inline the call to build classes. But we're going to leave build classes there because a bunch of tests actually rely on it for the time being. All right, so we're one step closer to moving build over into class containers, but we have a similar issue here as we've had before. First of all, we've got a dependency on Parser, so we're going to go ahead and create a new method, a new build method that receives Parser, and have this existing method basically call the new one. Same trick that we used before. I'm going to build that out slightly differently, but you get the idea. Then, of course, when we move it, what we're going to find is that JavaClassBuilder gets added as a parameter thanks to the IDE's version of this refactoring. So we're going to go ahead and remove that as well, at which point build is actually happening inside of class containers. All right, so it looks like that passes. Let's go ahead and do the actual move. Pretty straightforward. All right, there's that parameter we don't need. Let's make sure everything passes first. And let's change the signature and get rid of that parameter and then just check it one more time. So far, so good. All right, so now we're at this point where we have build and build classes are in our class containers. And the reality is build classes probably doesn't belong here. If we take a look at it, it turns out there's a conditional in here that's basically looking to see if it's a class file or if it is a container, so a jar, a war, or a zip. And if build classes was in our appropriate class containers, then we wouldn't need this conditional, right? We would know that it's a class file, or we would know that it's a jar, a war, or a zip. So we actually want to move that into those locations. And the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to code it as I want to see it, and then force that implementation. All right, I'm literally going to add a new code to the beginning of build. That is the logic I ultimately want to see and use, but while we put it in here, it's not going to collide with the behavior of build. All right, so what this is going to do is we're going to iterate through each container in this collection, and we're going to call build classes inside of that container, which doesn't exist yet, but we'll force it. Now, build classes is going to need a couple of things. It's going to need to know if we can accept inner classes, and it's going to need to know about our parser. So we're going to go ahead and pass those into this new call to build classes. Perfect. When we Alt-Enter, we actually get the option to create an abstract method. So we go ahead and do that, which is a good start for us. This won't compile because that method is not yet implemented in either of the actual container classes. So we're going to need to do that. And for the time being, to avoid any kind of a null pointer exception, let's just have these return empty array lists. That'll satisfy our needs. All right, let's talk through this a little bit. So when we look at build, this is the logic that we want, but we have to look at the logic that currently exists. Right now, build, what it does is it calls extract files, and then it calls build classes. Now, extract files basically iterates through all of the containers and collects the files. And then build classes has the guard clause, and after the guard clause, it basically checks to see which type of container did this come from, and then manages the call to parse from source. So build classes in directory class container is going to have very similar logic to what we're looking at. But if you recall, archive class container, the collect files is basically a hack that calls get file and returns it as if it were a list. So that is actually just going to go away altogether. All right, let's start with archive class container. The test file doesn't have a test for this, obviously. So just do something simple, drive it out. Basically, all we want to do is pass in our test jar and confirm that we get 5 entries back. Right now, we'll get 0 because we're always returning an empty array list. Now, I definitely could have done this better. I went and grabbed a test from another file and pasted it in here. And it turns out that basically the entire test was pretty much not useful to me. But the point here is we want to actually call the archive class container, pass it the test jar, and call build classes, and assure that the number of classes that comes back is 5, because that's how many are in that particular jar file. All right, so let's get this thing rolling. We're going to build out build classes in the archive class container by basically grabbing the code out of ClassContainers, build classes that is applicable, and let's go ahead and drop it in. All right, bunch of stuff that is broken. I'm going to go ahead and just repeat the logic for now. Just to make it fairly straightforward. This will be what our the actual collection that we return. We're going to add all to that. We got a compilation error. Let me get rid of that. There we go. And let's actually return classes. Okay, now it turns out, import that. It turns out the get jar file entries and the parse from source are both over in ClassContainers. Let's just go ahead and move them over here for a minute. Now, parse from source is actually needed by archive class container and directory class container. So let's move it over into our abstract class container so they both have access to it. Now, archive class container and directory class container both have access to it. Great. Let's put a try catch around this. And yep, let's just do what it was already supposed to do. Let's change that to E. Okay, great. And this needs 2 arguments. So we have the actual entry name, and then of course, if we can accept inner classes. And that's going to need to be a parameter to the method. And let's default that. Yep. So now we pass accept inner classes, and that should all work. All right, I just want to show you quick. We built out a few more tests for this. So we're checking a jar file, we're checking a zip file, we're checking with and without inner classes, just to make sure that this thing's actually working the way that we intended it to work. All right, so archive is done for all intents and purposes, fairly clean and straightforward. There's still a little bit of, we're using collect files unnecessarily, but we'll clean that up later. We want to move on to the directory. Now the directory is going to be more complicated because not only are we actually iterating through the files in the directory, but as we iterate through that, what we might find is, in fact, class files that we want to parse, but we might also find jar files or zips or wars. And when we find those, we need to actually instantiate an archive class container and then parse through those. So this gets a little more complicated. We're going to start off with just a simple test and no archive files involved. We're looking for a simple directory that actually has one class file in it. We want to use that to confirm that we get back one class file. Now there is a P1 directory that has an example class in it. And that's what we're going to go ahead and use. Get our collection of classes from buildClasses, accept inner, send it to standard class file parser. And then we're going to assert that we have one class. All right, now this actually failed because of the wrong directory, and it turns out that it is the builder and JDepend framework P1. All right, we jumped a little bit here. I just want to show you how simple this is so far. So buildClasses, we're effectively calling collect files, and then we are doing a parse from source on that contents and adding it to our result, returning the result. Very straightforward. This works for automatically for a simple directory or a directory with a bunch of classes in it. I'll show you that. We have two tests in here, one for our simple class directory and one for a more complicated directory that's got 39 classes in it. And we can see that they both pass with that simple implementation. All right, so let's write a test that actually points to our full build directory, the one that we're using for all our testing, because in a subdirectory of that, we actually have jar files, and that will cause this to fail because it won't know how to process the jar files. Okay, so the big thing here is directory class container can't collect the files and then parse them. It actually needs to parse them while it's collecting them. So we're going to inline collect files, leaving it by itself. And then we're going to start updating this logic so that effectively what we're going to do is iterate through the directory list, try and instantiate a subcontainer. If that works, we're going to collect files from the subcontainer. If that fails, we're going to catch it. And if it is actually a class file, then we're going to go ahead and parse that class file. All right, so real quick, looking at this one more time, buildClasses, pretty straightforward. What it's doing is going through all the files in the directory, iterating through them. It's trying to create a subcontainer by calling the factory. If that works, then it builds the classes from the container. If not, it catches it, checks to see if it's a class file. If it is a class file, then it goes ahead and parses from that source and adds that to the collection and returns everything. So our directory class container can now parse directories with jar files in them. All right, folks, I'm going to call that a wrap for episode 9. We're not quite done with this effort here, but the next steps are going to take us long enough that it's going to push us over the time limit. I'm trying to keep these to, I want to keep them to about 15 minutes. This one's getting up to over 20 already. So in the next episode 10, what we're going to do is finish this up, and we're actually going to remove JavaClassBuilder from the solution overall. And then we're just going to do a little bit of housekeeping to kind of get things in shape. We've left a bunch of little stuff just sort of hanging out there as we've been moving things around, and I want to get all of that stuff sort of cleaned up and get the code looking pretty decent. So thanks for hanging with me through all of this. If you're enjoying these, of course, thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in episode 10.